I'm Chris Stone, and welcome to this abbreviated version of Public Corruption Turnarounds. You're about to see a 30-minute version of a masterclass presentation I made at the International Anti-Corruption Conference in Vilnius, Lithuania in June 2024. The question I'm exploring here is simple. How do you replace endemic corruption in a public institution with a new culture of integrity? To answer that question, we'll look briefly at 5 examples, 3 real successes and 2 that looked like successes at the start, but ultimately failed. The successes come from the USA, from Paraguay, and Nigeria, stories of leaders who turned around their institutions in just a couple of years. The 2 that ultimately failed are the famous Manipulete operation in Italy, led by the magistrate Antonio Di Pietro, and the Lava Jato cases in Brazil, led by the judge Sergio Moro. My hope is that the patterns you see visible here can guide turnarounds elsewhere. Enjoy the class, and thank you for watching.
Can I get a big round of applause for Professor Christopher Stone? Christopher, good
Great to
morning.
be here.
We're delighted to have you here. You're going to take away your masterclass. In between, you're sometimes going to ask the audience's reflections, and hopefully in the end we have some time for Q&A.
Excellent. Terrific. So I'm trained as a lawyer. I worked as a criminal trial lawyer in Washington, D.C. at the start of my career. But I've spent most of the last 40 years working with public leaders around the world who are trying to turn cultures of corruption into cultures of integrity or just repair systems of justice. The police corruption that started me on this journey was in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the United States. This man, Richard Pennington, had been a police chief had been a police officer and then a supervisor in Washington, D.C. He'd built his career in Washington. But in 1994, when Mark Morial became mayor of New Orleans, he needed to find a reforming police chief to come in and deal with the corruption and the problems of crime in New Orleans. And he recruited Richard Pennington to come from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. The problems that Richard confronted when he arrived in New Orleans are legendary. New Orleans was in 1992 and again in 1994 when Richard got there, it was the murder capital of the country, the highest murder rate in the United States of any city. And the police there were solving only about a third of those homicides, which is about half the national clearance rate for homicide. So there was a lot of violent crime, and the police weren't able to deal with it. But it was far worse than that. Of the 1,500 police officers in the department, the vast majority were probably taking money on the side. The starting salaries were very low, but the opportunities to increase your income were legion. There was a lot of organized crime, and a lot of police started taking money on the side to offer protection or other kinds of assistance to some of the criminal gangs working in New Orleans. On the same day that Richard was sworn in, at his ceremony, the head of the FBI office in New Orleans came up to him, took him aside and said, I just want to introduce myself and I want to tell you, you have a lot of corruption in this police department, and we're actually running an investigation of a whole gang of your police officers who are working with the cocaine cartel to run drugs in the city. So Richard had he had lots of indication from the very beginning that he was facing a huge problem in New Orleans. It didn't turn around quickly. A few months after Richard got there was another incident where one of the police officers on the force, had been on the force for a few years, was at a restaurant run by a Vietnamese family, the Vu family. She left the restaurant at the end of her meal, went to connect with her boyfriend. They came back to the restaurant and they robbed it at gunpoint. They used a gun that she had stolen from the police evidence facility. And in the course of that robbery, they killed 2 members of the Vu family, and they killed the police officer who was working a detail as security guard on the side in the restaurant. The officer they killed had been Antoinette's partner, had been the police officer's partner. But Richard had a lot of culture of corruption to deal with in this department. So what did he do? He asked the FBI to assign 2 officers to embed them into the police department and to start working with him against the corruption in the department. But he also used working with the FBI and working with gathering information from inside the department, identified the people he thought were the ringleaders, the people who were driving the corruption, profiting from it, recruiting new police officers into that corrupt culture. There were about 1,500 police officers. He figured that there were probably the majority of them were in some ways participating in this corruption. But his theory was there were probably 10, 15% who were driving this, who were really the ringleaders of it. There were probably another 10 or 15% who were keeping their heads down and just not going along with it, even though they weren't whistleblowing, they weren't complaining to anybody. And there was probably about 70% of the middle who were just going along with the culture. That's what everybody did, so they did it too. So Richard's strategy was to eliminate the 10 to 15% of the ringleaders, do his promotions, build the new leadership he needed from that 10 to 15% who hadn't been participating, and hope that those 2 moves would just swing that middle into more compliance, more embrace of a new culture of integrity. And we'll see that formula show up in story after story of successful turnarounds, focusing on not everybody who's participated in corruption, but on those 10 to 15% who are driving it. Focus on the people who've not participated for your future promotions, and just move the people in the middle in terms of their behavior, so you don't have to lose all of the talent, all of the historical memory, all of the capacity of the organization. So he fired over 100 officers. They've only prosecuted about 50 of them. The others were fired. Many of them fought the firings in the Civil Service Commission. They aggressively fought back about that, and they were able to remove, between the firings, the prosecutions, and just driving some people out, he was able to move out about 200 people he'd identified as the people he needed to get rid of. But he also changed the rules. So the law permitted these police officers to do those details, to work on the side and earn money. But he instituted new rules that were stricter than what the law required. He built a standard in the department that was beyond what the law required. And that meant the officers weren't able to work more than a few hours a week on those side details. He didn't end it. He couldn't end it, but he tried to limit it through departmental regulation, not through changes in the law. He also tried to introduce new techniques of policing. He introduced, we could again talk for a long time on the side if you're interested, he introduced a series of reforms known as community policing, moving police officers closer to the communities they were policing, getting them more involved in those communities, and building better relations with the residents. He also introduced a series of data-driven strategy sessions in which the police department analysts were targeting areas where there was crime, asking the commanders what their strategies were, and trying to drive a culture of excellence in crime fighting in the city. He began to bring crime down. So crime started falling in New Orleans by double-digit percentages every year, year after year. So the murder rate came down, the violent crime rate came down, and the police department began to understand it was possible for it to succeed on crime in this situation. The real secret here was building pride, building a sense that you could fulfill the mission of the organization, and that source of pride is a theme we'll see over and over again in these successful turnarounds. Let me introduce a different story. Soledad Núñez was appointed in 2014 as the Minister of Housing in Paraguay. President Cortés was an independently wealthy politician, and so he freed himself from the political patronage system in the country and was able to appoint people who were not just the politicians, the members of parliament and the ministries that had been used to profiting from the government positions they inherited. The housing deficit, as they call it in Paraguay, was about 1 million houses, and yet the housing ministry was only delivering about roughly 1,000 new homes a year. It was going to take them forever to try and close that deficit. He turned to Soledad, a young civil society activist who'd only been part of his government, working on the government's plan on the Open Government Partnership. She'd been part of a young people's NGO working on issues of housing, and he turned to her, this young woman, to lead the housing ministry out of its troubles. The problems she faced were not, she didn't have the homicide problems that Richard had in New Orleans, but she had a lot of corruption too. The department was huge, but it not only wasn't producing housing, what it was mostly doing was producing jobs. Lots of people hired on patronage. The hiring was done absolutely by political party. Of the 3 major parties, each got 1/3 of the jobs. They hired more people than they had official positions for, so there were lots of people on temporary contracts. There weren't enough desks or offices for the people they hired, but they didn't have skills. They were being hired just on clientelist networks. And the procurement system worked similarly. Contracts went to favored companies. There were lots of ghost houses constructed. A ghost house, as you will have figured out just from the title, is a house that doesn't exist. The company gets 85% of the money up front for building it. They never build it. They walk away from the contract. They don't get paid the last 15%, but the money goes out and the house isn't there. The king of housing was not the minister, but was the second in command, the head of administration, who across political parties had always managed to keep a tight control of this new ministry. His name was Gonzalez. He was essentially the number 2 or the chief administrative officer, and he was, in some sense, the organizer of this clientelist patronage, bribe-filled structure. He even kept a separate office down the street from his formal office in the ministry where he could meet with contractors and run his deals. He built himself a lavish home. He included a football pitch on the home and used to invite everybody from the organization to come over for an annual football games and barbecue at his home. He was a beloved figure in the organization because he was the source of a lot of extra money and a lot of fun for the staff. It just wasn't an organization very focused on building housing. So how did Soledad respond to this? So first, she launched an investigation into some of that bribery. The investigation was designed and did focus on Gonzalez, and within a few months of taking the job, she fired Gonzalez, which was seen as someone who had protection in the Senate, had friends in politics who'd been entrenched in the organization for a long time. But she removed him and made a big public release about it. It was covered in the press a lot that he was removed. But then she set about trying to change the culture inside the organization. She hired a lot of young, what she called coordinators, young people who were assigned to each of the directors who reported to her in each of the divisions to help them improve and help them meet their targets. But all those coordinators not only reported to their director, they also had a dotted line reporting to her. She wanted to gather information, understand who she could trust and who she couldn't in the organization, who was on side and not. But she also wanted to help the organization actually get things done. She did the same thing Richard did, new ethics codes, training on integrity, but she also built a lot of transparency in the system. She created a public map available so people could see every contract awarded, see every project that was being done, and try to bring the public into the story. She also brought the public into the story by inviting journalists in. So instead of seeing journalistic coverage of all the problems as a threat, she wanted the journalists to come in, and she built relations with the news media. She launched her own social media platform, and she published on the organization's website every document she signed. So every time she signed something, that became public. She had the same theory that Richard did. She figured there was 10% of the people in the organization. She had a lower number than Richard did. She thought it was 10% who were the ringleaders. She thought it was 10% who had stayed free of the corruption, and it was the 80% in the middle she was trying to shift. At the end of her first year, she'd set a more reasonable target. She said she was going to build 12,000 houses that first year. She built 10,000. She missed the target by 2,000, but the organization had never built more than 2,400 houses in a year before, and they had been falling, not rising, under her predecessor. So she built 10,000 houses, and she took advantage of an index run by another part of the government that was hoping to improve efficiency in the governments of Paraguay. An index called MECIP, which is a statistical index of efficiency in government service. Her ministry, the housing ministry, had been scoring under 2 on a 5-point scale on that, and in 1 year she moved her agency score up to 4.39 on a 5-point scale. So from about 1.9, just under 2, up to more than doubling the score and becoming one of the most efficient organizations in the country. The third story I want to tell just very quickly is this man, Balaji Owasanoye, who was the head until this last February, the chairman of the ICPC, one of the 2 anti-corruption commissions in Nigeria. It's a very difficult environment to try and do a public corruption turnaround. But the brief story I want to share has to do with the ports in Nigeria. The Nigerian ports were another scene of huge corruption. When you're running a freight operation, everything depends on how quickly you can get into that port, get your material offloaded, load up the new materials, and get out of that port. And Nigeria was one of the worst in the world. So the World Bank, some of you may know, the World Bank, together with a private consortium, grade every port in the world every year on how they rank on essentially a measure of how efficiently the port runs, and that's mostly about the time it takes for ships to come in and out. Nigeria, of almost 300 ports that were ranked in 2021, Nigeria was in the bottom, the Lagos port was in the bottom 10 of those ports in the world because it took so long to get the freight on and off, and that's because at every step there was a new procedure all of a sudden discovered, and unless you made a payment, that procedure would stop whatever had to happen next. It could take days, weeks, months to get your ship out of that port. Balaji made this a priority and began to gather together all of the different government departments that were involved in that port operation with the ship owners. And in just a year, they ended up creating a whole new set of SOPs, of standard operating procedures, a clear set of rules that were understood by all the different agencies and the ship captains about what had to happen. And then he used his convening power to bring these agencies together to establish the SOPs. He wasn't in the lead, he was facilitating a process between all the agencies that were really responsible. But he had prosecution authority, and so he could investigate, they would investigate where the holdups were. They would bring someone in who was criminally implicated. But instead of prosecuting them, they just wanted the information. They wanted to understand how the corruption was working so they could work around it with the procedures. And in under 2 years, they were able to reduce the waiting time for those ships, at least in one account, from over 40 days to 4 days. In the report that was just released a couple of months ago, the latest World Bank report of now over 400 ports around the world. Nigeria, the Lagos port is 13th of 40 sub-Saharan ports, but is ahead, as you see here, is ahead of Houston, ahead of Seattle. So I just want to very quickly contrast those three stories with some of the two famous stories you'll know a lot about that, in my view, didn't work. They may have succeeded on putting some people in jail, but they didn't change culture. This is Antonio Di Pietro. He is the Italian prosecutor who led the Manipulette, the Operation Clean Hands prosecutions in Italy in the 1990s. Half of the MPs in Italy are charged and implicated in the corruption. Croxy is, there's 4 billion equivalent of $4 billion US in bribes uncovered and described going to the political parties. Croxy himself, the head of the Socialist Party, is protected through parliamentary immunity until finally, as the scandal builds, the parliament revokes his immunity. He's charged, he testifies in December 1993, admits to the particular bribe that he's charged with, $250 million US to a state-owned energy company, and he admits it happened, and he just calls it the cost of politics. 400 councils are disbanded across the country because of the corruption. Croxy himself is convicted in that bribery case, not surprisingly, since he'd admitted the bribe. In May of 1994, he flees to Tunis. He's sentenced to 27 years in prison in absentia. It's reduced on appeal to 10, and he dies, never having returned to Italy in 2000. But by the time he dies in Tunisia, the backlash has set in, and Manipulette is a complete failure. Berlusconi is elected. Berlusconi was a businessman at the time who was putting a lot of money into the PSI. All of a sudden, his politicians are no longer standing, so he goes into politics himself. He wins the election. He opens investigation against Di Pietro. Di Pietro is never formally convicted of anything, but he ends up resigning from his post. 2/3 of the prosecutions fail because the prosecution agency, now on the defensive, doesn't bring the cases in time, and so the 2/3 of the cases go nowhere. And of course, Berlusconi becomes a hugely successful, and some would say corrupt, example of the return of business as usual in Italy. Assessments by all sorts of international organizations and national assessments over the years describe the corruption in Italy as unchanged from the pre-Manipulette era. So prosecution looks like a dream case, like an amazingly successful criminal justice response, but no change in culture. Sergio Moro studies Manipulette, and decides he's going to get it right. He's going to do what they got wrong in Italy, and he's going to turn around Brazil's corruption as a prosecutor, doing what they tried to do in Italy, but he's going to get it to work. There were lots of people arrested, lots of politicians arrested, important CEOs, people who never thought they would be in criminal trouble for corruption in Brazil were not just arrested, but were sentenced and served time in prison. The bribery ring that was run by Odebrecht was paying almost $1 billion in bribes. And when the cases were done, Odebrecht did sign what remains today, I believe still today, the biggest penalty ever imposed in a corruption case anywhere in the world to the Swiss, US, and Brazilian governments, a total of $4.5 billion fine, or fines and penalties and disgorgement of profits that the company agreed to pay. So that looks like super success, but of course what happens is the backlash against this, as happened in Italy. The reports begin to surface about allegations that Moro was, as a judge, was improperly cooperating with and conspiring with prosecutors on strategy. Moro becomes Bolsonaro's justice minister, further discrediting the political neutrality of the prosecutions. The Lava Jato cases begin to unravel. The people going to prison start getting released from prison. And just this year in January, the Supreme Court voids or suspends the entire Brazilian side of that penalty against Odebrecht. And then in February this year, the Supreme Court suspends all of the fines imposed in Lava Jato, allowing the companies to renegotiate them because they were coercive, they believe at the time they were done. So you have stories in The Economist and elsewhere in the last couple of months talking about this backlash against Lava Jato and how corruption is back in these countries. What's the difference? What's the difference between these two sets of stories? The successful stories work institution by institution. They're not trying to take on the whole country. They're trying to understand that's getting down to the root. But the first way you get down to the root is you understand corruption is happening in public institutions. It's not happening in the country as a whole. It's happening in public institutions. And understanding your strategy needs to be institution by institution. Think of Balaji. He's running a national anti-corruption commission. He's got a mandate, but he's building a partnership with the people running the ports, focusing on that institution. He moves institution by institution in thinking about his strategy. There are partnerships in each of these. Remember, you've got the FBI coming into New Orleans. You've got the journalists with Soledad. You've got the port, all the port authorities in Nigeria. Instead, the prosecutors, they're on a crusade. They're out there. They know they need partners, but they haven't got the partners they need. They become the standard bearers, and therefore it's easier to undo them. But most important is that they're using a strategy. To me, the difference between a strategy and a to-do list is a strategy has a sequence. If it doesn't have a sequence, it's not a strategy. It's just a to-do list. But the point I want to leave you with about measuring progress is notice in the three stories successful, they measured progress by the ability of the organization to deliver on its mission, not by how much corruption they ended. They weren't measuring the corruption. They were measuring crime in New Orleans. They were measuring housing construction and efficiency in Paraguay. And they're measuring port efficiency in Lagos. That's how they're measuring progress. You build pride about the delivery on mission, not scores of how many people you've put in prison. The flaw in the three stories I told you was about sustainability. And I'll end with this point about Richard Pennington, my friend from New Orleans. Richard was a brilliant, no longer with us, but Richard was a brilliant police chief and a brilliant reformer. But he believed he was the reason it was succeeding, and so he didn't build in the sustainability. When he left as police chief after 8, almost 9 years, New Orleans had a different mayor, a different inside police chief, and in a few years, things had deteriorated a lot. Richard's lesson from that was he should have he should have invited more outside checks on his authority. He should have done what Soledad did, bringing the journalists in. He should have brought more oversight of the police department, welcomed more outside oversight. He was worried outside oversight would stop him. But in hindsight, he realized he should have done that. And when he went on to lead the Atlanta Police Department, he repaired that flaw and did actually try to bring outside oversight in. We don't have time today in our hour masterclass to talk more detail about the individual strategies. And you heard at the beginning you weren't going to get a single answer. But I will leave you with a framework for thinking about how to build a turnaround strategy in your own context, in your own organization. And it's just to hold in mind this idea of a menu. But instead of starter, main course, and dessert, think about the menu as past, present, and future. And make sure you eat a full meal. Make sure your strategy is holding somebody accountable for past corruption. You saw the prosecutions, firing, but every one of those success stories, their strategy involves accountability for past corruption. You have to have accountability for the past. Not everybody, but think about that 10 or 15. Think about the Gonzalez in your department. Everything has to have a present. It's not just, now I'm here, I'm not worried about it. The corruption is continuing under your watch, and what are your strategies to deal with the present? And then most important, make sure you have that dessert. Make sure your strategy includes what you're doing about the future. Think about who you're promoting from inside the organization. Are you promoting people who are known for integrity? Think about the artifacts, and we could tell a longer story that's going to hold the culture that you're building even when you're gone. And think about the outsiders you can be inviting in, whether it's journalists or auditors or others who are going to be able to, once they're in, are going to expect to be in, and when your successor comes in, they're going to expect to be able to be inside as well. You want to see what's on the menu? You can come to the 3-day version of this talk, which is in Oxford next May. We have a little more time to go into more of those strategies. And you can also get more about strategy from any of the 12 papers published as part of the Chandler Papers program that I and colleagues have been involved in over the last 3 years, trying to refine and build with some of the people we've been talking about today, the strategies that work and the strategies we might use in a more successful approach to corruption, institution by institution. So thank you very much for joining me this morning. I'm sorry I've held you a little bit late beyond the time, but I hope that there's some piece of this that will lead you to think this is work you can do, you can succeed in. You can't do it overnight, but you can do it in a couple of years. You can turn around even some of the most corrupt cultures in the world, in any country, in a couple of years. Thanks very much.